The Minnesota Vikings are going to fall to the Detroit Lions, and I am recording this as the game finishes up with 4 to 5 minutes left. 4 minutes and 24 seconds left. The Vikings are down 31-9, and it's all over but the crying. Regardless of what the outcome actually is at the end of this game, if the Vikings put up another touchdown or a single touchdown, make it 31-16, this game is over. The Vikings might lose 31-16, but they really lost 31-9. And it was an embarrassment at all levels by the Minnesota Vikings organization. A game, of course, that I predicted the Vikings to win. Because you look at Detroit and defensively and their injuries, and you look at what's going on with Detroit, and they hold the Minnesota Vikings to 6 first half points, 9 points in totality when it really mattered, is 10-9, and they are going to become the number 1 seed in the NFC. And now the Minnesota Vikings, in classic Minnesota sports form, have to travel to Los Angeles and play the Los Angeles Rams on Monday Night Football next week. Oh, oddly enough, the Vikings' first 2 losses of the season, and only 2 losses thus far going into this game, home versus Detroit and at Los Angeles. It's deja vu. So hopefully the Minnesota Vikings can get this ship corrected, because this was their worst performance of the season by far. From the get-go, opening possession offensively, Sam Darnold was off. They had a little false start when they were checking a play, whatever. Obviously, don't want that. It like a 3rd and 2 goes to 3rd and 7. He had Hockenson open, and he threw high and outside, hit Hockenson's far hand as he reached for the football, but he had Hockenson open, and he missed him. Next offensive possession, Darnold, 3rd and 18, unlikely position to get a first down. And the Minnesota Vikings call a pass play, has Hockenson open again for a massive play, overthrows him again. We're talking about within inches, both of these plays that could have changed the outcome of the game, could have completely changed the trajectory of how the Minnesota Vikings played offensively. Negated, because Darnold missed Hockenson by inches. And then you get into the red zone. And this was not a situation where Kevin O'Connell was calling poor plays. It was not a situation where the Vikings were just getting obliterated because O'Connell couldn't call the right play. This was a situation where Darnold could not execute. On the 4th down failed conversion, the Minnesota Vikings quarterback had Jefferson, hit him on the far hand, an inch too high. Had Addison open on both 4th down conversions, didn't throw him the football, and he was even looking at the guy. I took a picture, I posted it to my X account at MinnesotaTim1. Darnold is literally looking at Addison wide open. It was a pick play. On the second one, he did not throw him the football. Instead, he holds on to it, scrambles to his right, tries to find Addison in a contested situation, and the Vikings didn't convert. They got to the red zone 4 times in the first half and had 6 points. The play where Cam Akers ran the ball for 58 yards, and the Detroit Lions player makes a game-saving play, because that could have opened things up for the Minnesota Vikings offense. Instead, Akers gets tackled at the 5, And the Minnesota Vikings get 0 points out of that situation. When Akers was tackled, my first immediate reaction was, get your butt in the end zone, because the way things had been going for the Vikings, they were not going to score. And sure enough, their second turnover on downs. This game was the epitome of painful to watch. The Vikings are getting blown out right now. And that is not a true representation of just how close the Minnesota Vikings were to winning this game. You don't get to the red zone as often as they do and get blown out by 20 points. Sam Darnold was off, and he was off from the very beginning. He was juiced, he was excited, the adrenaline was going, but he was also not making the right reads. Addison open, wouldn't throw him the ball. Held on to the football a little too long. The Minnesota Vikings offensive line was getting obliterated by a Detroit Lions defensive line that is hurt, that are bringing in guys off the street, that are bringing in guys from the practice squad. And a game-changing situation that I thought would be that wasn't. A Detroit Lions cornerback, Terrion Arnold, who was talking all the smack before this game. And it turns out he was right. Gets hurt. And the Vikings are still in the game. And the Minnesota Vikings do not take advantage of that situation. I mean, how many times do you see it? You see it all the time in the NFL. Starting cornerback goes down, backup comes in, and the quarterback and the wide receiver and the offensive coordinator attack the backup cornerback. How many times did the Minnesota Vikings exploit a secondary that was banged up and on their final leg? The Lions put a season-high 15 pressures on Sam Darnold tonight, according to Kevin Seifert of ESPN. And another situation that happened in this game. The Vikings down 2 scores at this point, and this represents how this game went. Describes perfectly how this game goes. The Lions are driving down the field and going to put the game away. Andrew Van Ginkel drops a pick 6, taps it up in the air. Okay, great play. The ball literally falls into his hands, and he would run into the end zone, and he could not capitalize or execute on that play. Darnold just a little off. Van Ginkel just couldn't quite execute it. Will Reichard, what is Will Reichard doing? The first kick that he had is a shorty. He almost missed it wide right. It's like, oh, it's a chip shot. He almost missed a kick that was about 30 yards. And then the Vikings kicked the field goal before half, thinking, oh, it's going to be 7-6. And then he kicks it out of bounds. Lions get it at the 40. They complete a couple passes and field goal range, 10-6. That's another representation of how this game went. The Minnesota Vikings were poor in almost every single category. The Vikings defense, although they gave up 4 touchdowns to Jahmyr Gibbs in the Lions offense, they did everything that they could do to keep them in the game. The Lions scored 10 points at halftime, 3 thanks to Will Reichard. And interception by Smith, interception by Ivan Pace Jr. They're putting the offense in high successful situations. Ivan Pace Jr. picked it off, and the Vikings were ready to score a touchdown right away. Harrison Smith's interception was near the 50-yard line. Those are 2 situations that the Minnesota Vikings offense could have pounced on and didn't. Red zone issues, failed execution issues. And you've got to give credit to the Lions defense for making plays. The Cam Akers tackle, for example, that's a huge play. You got to give credit for them executing. Will Reichard kicks it out of bounds. Lions execute and get into field goal range. But the Minnesota Vikings offensively were as bad as we've ever seen in a situation where the Detroit Lions defensive secondary is finding guys off the street and plugging them in. The Minnesota Vikings have the best wide receiver in the league. And his stat line was atrocious considering the situation. 3 receptions, 54 yards. Oh, sometimes, Jefferson 3 catches. That means other guys got to dominate. No. Jalen Naylor, 3 catches. Aaron Jones, 5 catches. Jordan Addison, 1 catch, 0 yards. TJ Hawkinson, 2 catches, 9 yards. How does that happen? How can the Minnesota Vikings offense look so smooth and so fluid during this win streak, and then all of a sudden Addison gets shut out? Jefferson has 54 yards. Hawkinson has less than 10 yards. This is beyond my comprehension right now, because the Minnesota Vikings offensively have been torching teams recently. 27 against Seattle, 27 against Green Bay, 30 against Chicago, 42 against Atlanta, 9 against the Detroit Lions secondary that is hurt and finding guys that aren't rotational players and plugging them in. And they slowed down the Minnesota Vikings. Unbelievable. Painful. And hopefully this is a situation where the Minnesota Vikings choked. They choked. And they can learn from this situation and go to Los Angeles and be crisp. Because what I would rather have happen is I would rather have the Vikings choke against the Detroit Lions and have that experience and use that experience going into the game next week against the Los Angeles Rams than the other way around. They dominate the Lions. They're looking like the number 1 seed. They host the home game against whoever, and then they choke the home game. So if there was a positive to take out of this game, they got the choke out of the way. They got their struggle out of the way. And now they can prepare and get ready for their matchup against the Los Angeles Rams. This is a bummer of a game. You know, you get so excited for Sunday Night Football, which I hate Sunday Night Football. I'd rather play 12 o'clock noon. Kids are napping. Sunday Night Football, you wait all day for Sunday night. It's like the worst thing ever. It sucks. And it's like 10:30 at night and I'm recording this right now. It just sucks. Kevin Sievert posted this. Per ESPN research, Sam Darnold has been off target on 50% of his passes to this point. This is at halftime. This season, he hasn't had a game higher than 22%. Darnold was off. There's just no other way around it. The Vikings wide receivers were open. I guess that's how we can describe this game. Vikings receivers were wide open. Darnold could not hit them. He was overthrowing. He was not throwing. He was rattled. He was seeing ghosts. He got happy feet in the pocket. Darnold could not execute on the Minnesota Vikings' biggest stage of the season when they had an opportunity to capture the number 1 seed in the NFC. Kevin Sievert also tweeted, he's one of my main guys, that Darnold at one point had 8 overthrows. This is at halftime again. The only other game with more was in week 7 of 2019 when he had 12 while with the Jets versus the Patriots. Darnold was not in sync. He was not in rhythm. And he was overthrowing guys. Jefferson wide open in the end zone. He had a little fake slant and out, wide open. 10 feet wide open, overthrew him. There's just no explanation for that. He could have lobbed the ball up to Jefferson. He could have just been standing there. Overthrew him. That's just the way the game went for the Minnesota Vikings tonight. And hopefully that it's one of those situations where because everything went wrong for the Vikings, everything went wrong, that they got it out of the way and everything will go right for the Minnesota Vikings next week on the road in Los Angeles. But there's no doubt that losing this game hurts the Minnesota Vikings' chances to get to the Super Bowl. The idea is you get a bye, you get Darnold fully healthy because he's been dinged up these last few weeks, and then you take that bye week, get healthy, prepare for the team, get an extra week of rest, and you play 2 home games and you're in the Super Bowl. Well, now you got to win, 3 away games at LA. And I don't know how the brackets is set up right now, but then you got to play whoever, I don't know, the Packers or Eagles or the Commanders or Buccaneers, however the bracket is set up. Regardless, the Vikings got to win 3 away games in a row, which the first one would be at LA. The last one would be at Detroit. And the middle one, who knows what that would be. That's the road to the Super Bowl right now. And there's no doubt that that's more challenging than playing 2 home games to try to get to the Super Bowl. So it's just a killer. And it's a heartbreaker. And it was a painful game to watch because the Minnesota Vikings defense did so much to try to keep them in the game in the first half. Interceptions, tackles, making plays, stopping the Lions on 4th down. And eventually, late in this game, the Detroit Lions offense was going to click. Eventually, they were going to find something. So in that first half, that was the Minnesota Vikings' opportunity to jump on them early and get an early lead like they did against Green Bay. And they had the opportunities to do it. They just did not execute. They executed at one of the poorest levels that I have ever seen a Minnesota Vikings offense execute. From the offensive line to Sam Darnold. And, maybe part of it was because the NFL officiating treated this game like it was a playoff game. There's a lot of extra grabbing. There's a lot of extra physicality that you don't see during a regular Week 9 football game. And they treated it like a playoff game, as they should. Let the players decide it. But the Minnesota Vikings weren't ready, at least Sam Darnold wasn't, to win this football game. And it's a bummer because the season has been so special, and maybe it still will be. But the road gets way more challenging because of this loss. And we'll see what happens from here. But the Minnesota Vikings, it's a final. They didn't even put up a touchdown on their last drive. They lose 31-9. And what's crazy about this is Darnold didn't have a pick. Nobody had a fumble. And the Minnesota Vikings only scored 9 points. The story of the game is the red zone. You get to the red zone 4 times and you score 6 points. You put touchdowns on the board, it's 28 points. It's game-changing. It changed the course of the game. And they got to the red zone 4 times in the first half. It could have been 28-7 at the end of the first half. And then Lions make their second half run, and it's a close game. They make their adjustments. It came down to that. And the Minnesota Vikings could not execute. And Jahmyr Gibbs went off. 4 touchdowns. 4 touchdowns. 3 rushing, 1 receiving touchdown. Hey, he was good. And the Minnesota Vikings defense could not hold off the Detroit Lions forever. It was only a matter of time before they scored. And they did their best. But the Minnesota Vikings have a lot to work on this week to try to get ready for their matchup versus the Los Angeles Rams on the road. It's going to be tough because the Rams are rolling. Sure, they lost to Seattle, but they weren't playing anybody. They ratsed and sat everyone because they could. They had the playoff spot clinched, but they've been hot. Since Stafford and Puka and Cooper came back, they've been rolling. And there's a big challenge for the Minnesota Vikings coming up. Thank you for watching this episode. Thank you for making this podcast part of your day. Darnold, 18 for 41. 43% completion percentage. Oh, just a killer. Wow. Just a killer. And the biggest spot of the season, Darnold couldn't deliver. Just a killer. Vikings, 14-3. NFC wildcard team. Crazy. Crazy game. Hopefully the Minnesota Vikings get another shot at the Detroit Lions in a few weeks. Thank you for watching. Thanks for making this podcast part of your day.